Thank you everyone for sticking around this long. We know it's getting to the end of the day, so we're gonna keep it pretty tight. We'll probably chat for 20 minutes or so, and then we're gonna open it up to questions from you, so start thinking now. You all probably know a little bit about Jim. From his bio, he heads up disability inclusion for JPMorgan Chase. But to get started, I wanted to dig into that a little bit deeper because it's sort of my understanding that Chase interviewed like 100 people for this position before they pulled you out of retirement to
That's true.
to take it. So can you just dig into that a little bit and how that all came to pass?
Sure. I'm 130 years old, so I was actually in Kingston at a pool in Kingston with my granddaughters, and I was heading to the luncheonette to get lunch for my granddaughters, and I got a call from a headhunter, old friend of mine, and told me that there was a job that Chase was looking to fill to take on disability inclusion for the firm. And I basically said, I can't do this right now. I'm getting chicken nuggets for my granddaughters, so maybe I'll call you later from home. But that's how it started. I had retired from IBM after 39 years, and I was a marketing and communications executive for IBM, but obviously I'm disabled, and I did disability on the side. So when I got the call, I started speaking to the recruiters, and I agreed to do the interviews. And the question I had was, why does Chase Manhattan Bank, JPMorgan Chase, why are they interested in this? Why do they want to do this? Because I know JPMorgan is one of the biggest banking brands in the world. And quite honestly, they said to me, we've been able to do diversity very well with women, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, GLBT, etc. But we can't figure it out for people with disabilities. And so I thought about it, and I said, why would this brand try to hire a 61-year-old quadriplegic into this job unless they were serious about this? So when I did about 15 interviews, and I asked if there was something wrong with me. How many interviews do you usually do for this thing? And they said, we do about 6 or 7. I said, why did I do 15? And they said, Jim, this is going to be a global job. We want you to tackle this around the world. So they were serious. So when I looked at my wife, we had just moved to Massachusetts from New York. I know this is a longer answer than you wanted. And I said, we just got here, do you want to go back? And she looked at me and said, if you go back, you could help a lot of people. And we did. So 3 years hence, I relocated back here, and now I'm working out of Boston. But Chase wanted to do this, and I believe we're one of the top companies for people with disabilities, 3 years later.
Yeah, I was gonna say that you've been sort of like their secret ingredient in the sense that they were largely unsuccessful until 15 interviews later, you took on this role. What have you been able to offer them that, previous efforts didn't?
Well, first I was disabled, and I actually knew the struggle. I broke my neck body surfing in Puerto Rico when I was 25 years old. I was a coach of a swimming team. I was working for IBM at the time, and I recovered. The good news is that I've never been unemployed in 43 years. So there is hope for people like us. But what I tried to bring to the table was the ingredients that added up to this is why I came back. Number one, technology has improved. Technology has leveled the playing field for people with disabilities. And number two, medical advancements have kept us healthier. So with that, intersection of technology, attitudes, and the law, the ADA actually, why not do something that normalizes disability instead of having people feel sorry for us? So one of the things I did was that we were not going to hire people with disabilities because they were disabled. So anybody that works for us today applies for a job through our websites for the job posts that are there. You have to qualify for the job. We don't take you because you're in a wheelchair, you're blind, you're deaf, you have a mental illness. We take you because you qualify for the postings on the job. That's a key difference. To date, I'll give you the win. We've hired over 3,000 people in 3 years since I got there.
Wow.
Around the world. That's higher than most companies, I understand, hire about 600 people a year. We've exceeded that. I think we're one of the top now in the world doing this.
What sort of outreach have you guys done to sort of hone in on this largely untapped market? Like, I understand that someone with a disability still needs to qualify for the position, but a lot of companies struggle with even attracting that talent, and like finding the right sort of accessible tools and the right messaging where someone with a disability even feels comfortable completing that application. What have you guys done to mitigate that?
We've done it all. So we have worked with our recruiters. We've trained them to understand how to approach people with disabilities. And that's the biggest success I think we've had. It's the attitudinal success. And so we don't feel sorry for this group. We respect them, but we also have programs. I had to do all this simultaneously with my teams, setting up an accommodations team to deliver accommodations. We've written a policy and a standard worldwide for the firm that says what's our position on hiring people with disabilities. And those policies weren't necessarily for the disabled, they were for the managers to empower them to hire. The other key thing that made this thing work is that the budget for buying accommodations or providing them is held at the top of the business. The manager doesn't have to worry about, gee, Jim, I don't have a budget to pay for this. Or, you know, how do we get automatic doors if we need it? How do we put in ramps? How do we change buildings? So the beauty of the firm, and I've got to tell you something that not many people know. When I was interviewed for this job, I was just not interviewed by the line of the businesses. I was interviewed by Jamie Dimon as well. So he had his hands all over this deal to make it work. And if it works from the top, it's going to work throughout the corporation, which it has. But we do provide accommodations. We hire interpreters if we have to, and we put them on the job to work with our deaf people. We have inside captioning, and we do that around the world through our technology. So for our deaf employees who work every day, it's a twofer. The technology helps us maintain the privacy of the bank and protects our assets, right? But everything is done inside, so outside people really can't come in and learn about the business unless they're part of the business. So we made this work for the bank as well as for our customers and our clients.
You mentioned empowering managers with, sort of larger budgets or budgets that come from the top so that they can hire as they see fit without that consideration. What other steps have you guys taken or would you recommend taking to empower managers to hire people with disabilities and also, in some sense, maybe shed their own biases? Because we have chatted about this and talked about how a lot of managers are a little hesitant to hire someone with a disability. What sort of top-down directives can a company put in place to help resolve that?
Well, it's not just the managers, it's all of us. So if we're honest about this, able-bodied, and I was able-bodied once, so I'm not disparaging anybody here, right? But able-bodied people normally have an aversion to people with disabilities. The two things that able-bodied people think about is, am I going to be politically incorrect, or am I going to catch something that they have? So people are afraid to touch disabled people. Rarely does someone came, hey Jim, how the hell are you, and give you a big bear hug, right? Until they know you. But once we worked on this through training, through talks, and I just call it. I had a question in an audience, a large audience, and one of the questions I got was, well, Jim, what do you say when you meet a person with a disability? So I paused, and it was a great question. I've had that question before. And I said, how about hello? How about, would you like a cup of coffee? Can I help you to the table? And so as I try to demystify this for folks, it starts to catch on. You realize that we have more in common as disabled people with able-bodied people than anybody thought. So for example, I'm married over 30 years to the same woman. That's a rarity in this world today, right? Number two, and she's able-bodied, French-Canadian, a doll, blue eyes, I can go on. I have 2 children. My son Jimmy, my daughter Danielle is a lawyer. My son works for the intelligence community, and he's 29. He's going to be 29 on the 20th. And when he was working for the Defense Department, I said, what do you do? He says, Dad, if I tell you, I have to kill you. Again, we have a normal family life. And so, we've raised our kids, we've done, I have more in common with you. And that's what I ask our managers to think about, and what I ask people that engage with us to think about that, and to think about it that way, and all of a sudden it dissipates. I attribute this to aliens landing, on the planet, and when they see disabled people, we're aliens. The other part of this is interesting. When we coach managers, we try to teach them about hiring people with disabilities. So I have an 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule goes like this. If you're a manager, you usually get resumes and bios to hire people. And they have names on it, right? Mary, Jim, Bob, whatever it is. So why is it that when a person with a disability walks into the job, after you call them in, after reading their bio, why are you skittish? So I tell managers, every manager brings in a person after reading a bio because they have 80% of what they need to do the job. And what us managers have to do is teach that person the 20%. That's no different whether you're disabled or not, because you already accepted the bio from a person that was blind, deaf, or sitting in a wheelchair. So why are you doubting that? You just have to teach that person 20%. The second thing I tell them is, do you know how much trouble it took to get to your place of employment if you're disabled? Taking the train, the bus, the subway, living in New York, dodging taxi cabs in the street in a wheelchair? Not easy. One of my managers, when I moved to Boston 3 months ago, said, Jim, I hear you're taking the train to work every day. Or she said, how do you get to work every day? I said, well, I take the train. She goes, how does that work? Well, I said, I always have a seat, right? Yeah. And so the neat thing about Boston and New York is, if I may, because I know you tease us all the time, right? Boston, the Yankees, dare I say it, is that the priority seating with the MBTA is just fantastic. And I'm very blessed to move up here because the clientele on the train, people get up. No one gives up a seat in New York. But in Boston, it's civil. And so, but these are the things that you see as you walk around. It's just great to live here.
It is a very friendly city. Just sort of pivoting, I suppose. You have had a lot of success in new hires with Chase, but I know that from what I've read that you've written, the sort of next step is grooming more disabled people for leadership positions, and making that a stronger pipeline and like a better pathway for those people to move up. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, everybody wants to get promoted for sure, The thing about, so this is a two-way street with people with disabilities. When I got to talk to people with disabilities when I got there, I spent about 6 months learning the culture, talking to the various disability groups, the blind, the deaf, mobility impaired, mental illness, for example. And I'll just stop at mental illness for a minute. We just had a huge 2-year campaign. It started in England. England had a law that talked about mental illness and how to help people keep them on the jobs. Well, after that first year, we expanded it worldwide. So all of JPMorgan Chase employees feel free to talk about this. And when we write and talk about disability inclusion at the firm, we have about 250,000 employees at the bank. Almost 150,000 people have read our articles on disability. Now we know we don't have 150,000 people who are acknowledged as disabled, but this is catching on because people don't like to talk about it. And because we created an environment where the culture is changing, it's starting to work. When I talk to employees about their disabilities, when they come and talk to me about it, I say, why didn't you tell your manager that you had a disability? Whether you were sight impaired or had something else, an invisible disability. And the employee said to me, because I'm afraid they don't think I'm qualified to be a leader. Or I'm afraid to tell them that I have a disability because he or she may not think I could be a good worker. So there are two things going on at the bank. We have to educate our employees to come out and identify, and we have to talk to managers the same way. So the good news is that when I got to the bank, 1.6% of the population identified that they had a disability. 3 years later, it's up to 3.2. It's a small change, but it's a change. And that means to me that the culture is changing.
You actually just led beautifully right into my next question. And I think this will be it, and then we're gonna take some questions from you guys. You know, you have mentioned to me that most people with a disability submit 2 resumes. One mentions the disability and one doesn't. And, you know, unfortunately, the one that doesn't, you know, more frequently renders a job interview. But if we like say hypothetically that it's the best case scenario, right? You have a company that's very welcoming and willing to make accommodations. Statistically speaking, a lot of those companies still have people with invisible disabilities hanging around, just sort of white knuckling it without any accommodations. What sort of coaching can you give managers to convey, you know, the idea that this is a safe place to have those conversations and to mention their disability, and that they're not going to be penalized or thought of as, you know, not fit for leadership?
No, that's a good question, but what I've learned in my 130 years on the planet is that it's about show me, don't tell me. And so what we do at the bank is we show them. Again, there are the policies in place, the accommodations are there, we talk about it freely, and people are stepping up like crazy. But the other part of this thing is, I tell them, the disabled employees, you have to own your disability. People with disabilities have this aura about us where we feel less than or we're not going to be accepted. And so if I can't get my talented people with disabilities to come out and step out, it'll never, I said, no one is going to call you out and say, hey, Mary, do you want to be a vice president today? That never happens unless you go to Harvard or you're brilliant, which, you know, many of us are not, including me. But the idea is, how do you position yourself for success unless you step up and convince your manager that you can be a leader? And so what I think about is not only hiring people, but how do you get people into a leadership position? So I was hired into the bank as a managing director. Right. And so my card was, when I was offered the job, there was another discussion about what level should I come into. And I said, look, you can't bring a person into a global road a global role as anything less than a leader, because no one's going to pick up your phone calls. And I knew that at IBM, right? So you have to be assertive as a disabled person. You have to have the talent, and you have to have the experience to work in a corporation or a newspaper or anything else, or a baseball team. You have to have skills, right? So the idea is, how do you position yourself as a disabled person to fit into the work environment that you want to go in? There's no gift here. I am rated like any other executive at the bank, and if I fail, I fail badly, right? So we have to own it completely. But this is the new era of disability inclusion. It's no longer about automatic doors. It's not about the ADA. It's about what are the skills and talents that you can bring to an organization given your disability.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, see one person with a hand. There's a mic runner coming. Just wait 1 second. Thank you.
On the most part. So I'm interested in knowing what kinds of supports and accommodations you have in place for folks who maybe are neurologically or developmentally disabled.
Well, that's a great question. We are just now, and we've had a history of this, we are hiring the developmentally disabled now. In the last year, we've looked for work that can better be served by the developmentally disabled population. For the first 2 years, I didn't bring anybody in with developmental disabilities because I didn't know what work we had. But what we found out is that there were certain jobs that able-bodied people do poorly because the job is rote. It's sort of like we bring in people on the autism spectrum. We've hired 160 over the last 3 years. And now we're bringing in developmentally disabled people to do certain jobs where they can outperform able-bodied people. Testing, mortgage applications, checking things, all those kinds of things that require people to pay attention to it specifically, but have the tenacity to do it. So we're finding like we're matching work to people, which sort of like is a new idea. So we are getting there, but it's a slow process.
Oh, hi.
Follow up on that. In terms of the cognitive disabilities, you've also got things like auditory processing disabilities, you've got dyslexia, dysgraphia, people who might have difficulty accessing the application process even, but who could become really good employees, making it a very high cognitive level and being great problem solvers. How do you work? What are your thoughts on that?
It's not easy. The idea is that, again, I go back to being qualified to do a job, but we also, with the autism spectrum, we found out that in certain jobs they outperform able-bodied people. So all that has worked because of the sciences, the testing, the learning. So I don't think that, we can take everybody with a disability, but we could take people who are qualified to do certain jobs and give them the accommodations they need to do it. We've done about over 5,000 accommodations for people around the world, from giving them technology, giving them interpreters. We even have an internal captioning system that works around the world for our deaf employees, as I mentioned. So we find ways to do it. I don't know that any company can take everybody, but we're making a dent. We have it all. We buy the accommodations. I have an accommodations budget that works. The key is that the employee has to tell us, and they don't.
Oh, yes.
Have you been able to identify a correlation to increased customers based on the modifications you facilitated at Chase?
Say that again, customers.
So have you found a correlation to the work you've done with an increase in customers? I was going to say customers with disabilities, but I actually think you have a greater impact than that.
Yeah, my phone doesn't stop ringing with customers because they want to know what we're doing. I think, look, The good news is that we work to promote this kind of work on the outside, and it does two things. It brings people to us who may be able to work with us, and then it makes our teams try to figure out how much more can we move the bar with the right technology to get these people to work at our bank. But you know, working at a bank is one thing, but you could work for IBM, you could work in a hospital. And so if folks are in different industries, there are different ways to hire people, and that's always innovative. So I can't tell you that everything I'm doing here, so I figured about 80% of what I do can apply other places, but people have to tune it for their own jobs and their tolerance for having people do this kind of work.
Oh, yes. More to the team. Okay. We'll come back.
Oh, okay. I thought it was going to someone else. So Jim, quick question for you, which is that some of these things that you're discussing, the centralized accommodation in budget, the matching of different types of work to different types of abilities, perhaps along a broader spectrum than white-collar employers have traditionally thought, these strike me an awful lot as what we would call best practices, as things that would move the industry forward. To what extent is Chase taking these learnings, especially things like the matching of different works to developmental disabilities, which to my knowledge is an entirely new phenomenon in this broader field, and making sure, even though we all like competitive advantage, making sure to actually share that broadly in your industry and your community so that practice can be duplicated?
That's a good question, but I've worked with Google, the United Nations, the Mayor's Office in New York City, the Metropolitan Transit Authority. I'm going to meet with the MBTA up here. And so, you know, I think this is a new era, as I said, and the firm is sharing what we're doing with everybody else, because it's possible. I think it's possible to do now. I think it all comes down to, do you have the will and do you want to do this? Now look, there's a dirty little secret too about this. If you're a government contractor, you have to meet a 7% goal. But that's not what Chase brought me in to do, because no one has attained the 7% goal as far as I could tell. And I want to be the first. When you see us do that, you're going to see a press release and go out. That's what I want to do. But look, I think there's no excuse not to hire this group of people. And as we heard about some of the talent discussions here today, this is a great workforce. Our attendance is high. We don't have the medical issues we used to have with the better care. People with disabilities are loyal. They want to work. And it's a great area to look at.
Okay, so one more question.
Hi, Jim. Thank you. You guys are having a great, really valuable conversation today. So I'm curious if you faced or if you recognized resistance in your hiring managers, and if so, just resistance to being accountable for hiring disabled persons, and if so, were there any measures that Chase put in place for accountability?
We beat them up. But there
Do that.
is resistance, but there is resistance because they're uncertain. And once you get over that hump, and it's taken 3 years, right? And that's not bad, 3 years. But there is resistance because they just don't know. They don't know how, it goes back to just say hello, that kind of thing. And it's about human nature. And this dialogue, and I know this for the 30 plus years that I've been disabled, didn't happen 30 years ago. It was about, let's take care of them. Let's just help them with a little thing. But to think about a disabled person as a leader was like, you can't do that. But it's happening today. And then when you find out people like Bill Gates and a few other people have issues of disability, you go, man, there are people working with hidden disabilities that no one ever knew about. So it's more around us than not. And look, the biggest thing for me, and it's always daunted me, is when I talk to parents that have children with disabilities. And you know the number one question they ask me? What happens when I die to my disabled children? That kills me. And the idea is that if you don't start helping them become involved in society now, it's going to be a sad story, but it doesn't have to be. And so that's what drives me, you know, even more to do what I do.
And on that note, we are just about out of time. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
This has been very informative.